Hello everyone, welcome to NQA's webinar about the migration of OHSAS 18001 to ISO 45001. My name is Terry Fisher, I'm the Principal Assessor for OHS Management Systems here at NQA. So, we've already had our first question. Thank you for that. And that question is, what are the key differences between 45001 and OHSAS 18001? That should become apparent as we go through the presentation. For those of you that may need some additional information, NQA provide downloadable documents in terms of a migration gap analysis document, which goes through clause by clause and gives you a headline of the key differences between 18001 and 45001. And just to reaffirm, for all those registered as part of this webinar, it is recorded and it will be available on social media, and the presentation slides themselves will be emailed out to everyone so that they've got them for reference going forward. So hopefully we should be able to answer what the key differences are between the various standards as we go through this. So firstly, I'll just do a little of an intro into NQA. So as most of you will be aware, NQA have got a global presence throughout the world in various offices, covering numerous standards and certification requirements. We've been operating for over 30 years. Within the UK, we offer all-inclusive fees, so there's no additional travel and transport costs, and it's a transparent costing method. So what we say is what you pay, in effect. There we go, the handouts already appeared, I think, in the web chat, thanks to our marketing team. So, as we move forward, as I say, we don't charge travel, we don't have any hidden costs, we don't increase audit time for migrations or transitions from standards unless that's a requirement. And there has been a requirement put on to the migration to 45001, and I'll explain the reasons why as we go through. We don't require mandatory gap analysis prior to migrations and transitions, and we don't charge premium prices. We try to be competitive in the marketplace, and hopefully our existing clients will be able to confirm that we do offer value for money. So there we go. As I said at the start, a copy of the slides will be available and sent to all registered parties as part of the webinar. But as we're going through, if you do have any questions, if you can put them in the chat box, I'll try to answer them as we go, or if there's numerous questions on a similar theme, we'll answer those collectively. And just to clarify the point, I can't give necessarily specific answers related to a particular organisation. I can only answer generic questions on the standard interpretations and how it's applied to organisations. So I can't give company-specific answers to particular questions per se. So, first question we're often asked is why implement ISO 45001? The primary focus of this is enhancing OHS performance. So that's about protecting workers and prevention of ill health and injury whilst at work. That's the primary goal. So it can also help deliver cultural change within an organisation. It's a proactive risk management system. So it has a systematic approach. It can reduce culpability, and it can offer a level of an increased level of protection. depending on where that organisation currently is. And it can also be an external demonstration of commitment and also an internal demonstration of commitment linked to the culture of the organisation. It's a commitment by leadership that requires action and requires continual improvement. So that's a very broad outline of why we're looking to implement 45001 as an occupational health and safety standard. And it builds on the foundations that 18001 has already established. So some of the things that were established in 18001 won't significantly change, but a lot of the requirements have been either enhanced or there are some specific new requirements as I will go through. ISO 45001 adopts the Annex SL high-level structure, and that's in line with other management standards that have recently, in the last few years, been revised and updated. So 9001 has this structure, 14001 has this structure, etc., etc. So the structure is divided into 10, I'll say sections or chapters. And the auditable bits, the bits that we look at in terms of when we do an assessment in organisations, are items 4 to 10. So the first 3 about in the management structure are about the standard itself. It talks about what the standard is trying to achieve, the normative references, and the terms and definitions. Now, as subscribers to a management standard, it is worth having a read through those elements, even though they're not the particular auditable elements. Within the management standard. So it is worth looking at those. Sorry, I've just had a technical glitch. So it is worth looking at those first 3 elements, especially the terms and definitions, because that can be Eugene's saying he can't hear anything. That's the only person that's saying they can't hear anything. Is the audio coming through clear? Sound is loud and clear. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Eddie. Brilliant. Yep. Thank you, Paul. That's great. So it confirms that the system is working. So it must be a problem at your end, Eugene. Sorry about that. So in terms of the terms and definitions that are defined in the standard, it's always advisable to have a copy of the standard available to you so that you can look at the terms and definitions. There's also in the guidance elements of the standard, there's also some interesting reading there. So it's always worth having a copy of the management standard available to you as you're going down this journey of migration from 18001 to 45. There's some really interesting parts there and some explanations. So going back to Annex SL generally then, so the one new term, certainly a big difference between 18001 and 45 is the context of the organisation and the requirements within the standard structure for that. And also leadership has been expanded. So leadership and management has always been a requirement, but it really has been enhanced and expanded there. And just to touch on that point, I said at the start, there was an additional time allowance. So organisations that are migrating from 18,001 to 45, if their normal migration under 18,001 or recertification under 18,001 was, for example, 1 day, a minimum of 1 additional day will be required to cover context of the organisation and leadership elements, because they are new and revised requirements within the structure of the standard, which weren't present within the previous 18,001. Another question there. What suggestions do you have to keep admin proportional for small management teams? I would suggest, as we're going through, the basic principles of what you're trying to achieve remain unchanged if you've got 18,001. So a lot of the stuff you should be pleasantly surprised how much you're actually already doing. So there shouldn't be a great administrative burden in terms of requirements. This is about delivering effective management. It's not about increasing unnecessary administration, etc., to organisations. So in terms of the structure, as I say, the context and of the organisational leadership are really enhanced and new requirements in there. A lot of the other things, planning, support, operational, evaluation of performance, etc., and improvement are enhanced, and the wording's been developed, but there are no real new requirements in there in terms of basic requirements of what the management system's trying to do. And the other good thing about this, because the Annex SL has been adopted and it is common to other management standards, you can see if they're all adopting the same principal structure as Annex SL, then there may be some consolidation and benefit of integration and doing common activities across multiple standards. So to some extent, ISO 45001 has been designed and developed to enhance integration with existing management systems to reduce any duplication of work and effort, especially applicable not only to small organisations, but to all organisations. People don't want to duplicate work unnecessarily. So I think the structure there is really, it's long overdue in terms of, it's about time they standardise the standards, as they say, and that's exactly what they've done. So that's the structure that we're looking at in terms of ISO 45001. I'll just bring all these up as an overview. So one of the things that the standard is trying to deliver, that as you implement this, and as you should have experienced with 18,001, is it trying to deliver a cultural change and improvement in performance. So just as an overview of each section. So section 4, the context of the organisation, is looking at external and internal issues and activities and the purpose of the organisation. Most organisations do this and know this instinctively. They know what their organisation is about, but it's a good opportunity for you to stand back and think, well, why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve? What strategic direction is the organisation going in? What culture have we already got? An organisation may be looking at doing some radical changes, certainly in light of current restrictions and COVID scenarios, etc. A lot of organisations, the context of their organisation has changed significantly, and the management standard is there to support that change in those requirements. And it's trying to give you mechanisms to identify, well, what's changing, who needs it, who's that change being driven by, what do we need to do as an organisation, and how we're going to deliver those requirements. In terms of the interested parties, so within 45001, workers are the central interested party, but you've also got other interested parties, and it could be regulatory, legal requirements, commercial considerations, etc., stakeholders within the business, customers, suppliers. There's all sorts of interested parties that can link into OHSAS 45001. Sorry, ISO 45001. And once you've defined the context of the organisation and the interested parties, then you can look at the scope of the organisation and the scope of the management system, and that's all required in section 4. Section 5 is the leadership section. So that talks about the strategy and the policy requirements, the definitions of roles and responsibilities, and the requirement of participation and worker engagement throughout the process. Section 6 looks at hazard identification and risks and opportunities, compliance obligations and OHS objectives. In section 7 and 8, they're looking at resources, competence, awareness, communications and documented information. Also looking at the operational control, the hierarchy of control that needs to be applied. We're looking at change management, procurement, contractor control and emergency preparedness. And then in sections 9 and 10, this is where we're looking at performance and evaluation and corrective action and improvement processes. So things like internal audits, management review, incident and corrective actions, improvement objectives, reviewing that as part of the management review, and the improvement process overall. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of what, how the management system stacks up in terms of how it works and the various elements there within. There's a question on what is the difference between a risk and a hazard, if we can explain. I'll go through that when we get to that relevant part in the presentation, if that's okay. So, the starting point of the system is looking at the scope of the management standard. But you can only define the scope once you understand the context, so what the organisation is trying to do, how it delivers that, who it delivers it for, what is it trying to do and what's it trying to achieve. Only when you understand the context and the interested parties can you then define the scope of the management system, so what it applies to within your organisation, scope of activities that it covers, etc. So that's what needs to be considered. And obviously then, in terms of that, it's influenced by the leadership and direction of the organisation, the workers and the interested parties, what they actually do, how they achieve that, how they've identified the various interested parties, and the context in which it operates, so which market and sectors, etc., all influence the scope and the context. The scope needs to be documented, and the scope can be from a sentence to a few sentences, but it's generally a brief overview as the management system is going to apply to this type of operation in this marketplace, producing this type of service type statement. And just to clarify a point that's come up in one or two webinars previously, the scope within the management system can be more comprehensively documented than the scope of registration. The scope of registration is the words or sentence that goes on your certificate of registration from NQA or another body. So that scope within your manual or how it's documented within your system can be more comprehensive and can touch on context and leadership as part of a documented information, and the scope of registration can be different. The scope of registration is quite a brief statement that's generally used for your certification. So just to clarify that point. So in terms of context, when we're thinking about context, and this is a standard phrase, And a lot of people have difficulty interpreting this, but in simple terms, if you think about the different contexts of organisations, such as a water company, which may be a public limited company, a university, which is obviously an educational establishment, for example, a food manufacturer, a limited could be privately owned, or it could be a smaller family-owned engineering business, a small enterprise. Each one has its own context, so it does things differently. It may be doing something similar to someone else, but that organisation is unique in its own terms in both the marketplace, the way it does things, the resources it's got available to it, the strategy of the organisation, the existing culture and performance elements that it needs to address, etc. That context of the organisation is really a critical element, what helps define the management system and what needs to be achieved by the management system. So it's really important that people understand how context influences the management system and the standard. So within the clauses of the context of the organisation, within section 4 of the standards, and as I said, this is a new element, so this is why the additional time's been allocated to cover this within the migration process from 18,001. So this didn't exist before. It was always inferred, but it didn't exist as a clause requirement, as an audible element, whereas it does in the Annex SL and 45,001. So the organisation needs to understand its context and what does the organisation do. It needs to understand its interested parties. The core interested party, as far as the OHS system is concerned, are workers, and then there are other interested parties that have equal importance, but a core one that cannot be overlooked is the workers within an OHS management system. So it's about understanding who the interested parties are, what those interests are, and how you'd meet and deliver those needs and requirements of those interested parties. So it's understanding that. There's also some new terminology that's been introduced within 45,001, which is common to 9,000 and 14,001. It's documented information, traditionally regarded as procedures and records, etc. So documented information is an all-inclusive term. We'll talk about that a little later on, but it's basically anything that's documented. So documents aren't necessarily formal, hard copy documents. It could be data, it can be information, etc., etc. So when it says the scope must be available as documented information, it must be documented and it must be available within the system for people that need to understand what the scope of the management system is. And then there are some general requirements of the management standard that are also defined in 4.4 of the standard itself. So there's some general requirements there about what the standard must, what the system must include. When looking at the context and the various things, a lot of organisations use different models, so pastel analysis, and that can be spelt differently depending on who you are and where you go to, but the principles are still the same. And it's also looking about the internal factors. So external factors, obviously legal, political, economic, social, technology, environmental, etc. They can all have an influence on the management standard. And the internal factors could be the corporate strategy, the structure of the organisation, the culture and style of the organisation, the existing staff awareness and knowledge that the organisation already has in place, the skills and knowledge that may have developed over a period of time, that could be developing that could be actually introducing new technologies which could challenge existing skills, etc. So there's all sorts of things that must be considered. And also the systems and operating style of the organisation, what it's already got in terms of resources and structures, etc. So there's some examples of how you can consider the internal and external factors in terms of context. In terms of workers and other interested parties, I'll give you a quick slide here just to demonstrate some of the commonalities that may exist between the various standards. Obviously, as I've said, workers are a core interested party within this, and included, we use the term workers directly to include not only direct workers that are employed by the business, but subcontractors and other workers that may be impacted on. So it's an all-inclusive term, workers rather than staff or employees. But in terms of interested parties, it can include contractors, managers, agency members, regulators, customers, members of the public and visitors, etc. They could all have be influenced by the operations of the organisation, and they can also have an influence on the organisation and how it operates. So they are the interested parties. Can also include people like shareholders and depending on how the organisation is structured in terms of who it's owned by, etc., etc. Whether it's part of a group, whether it's a single entity, all these things can change and influence the context. You can see some commonalities there. Customers, for example, regulators. I think all organisations are subject to some form of regulation and some type of regulatory framework. So they could be common across multiple disciplines of standards, including 14,001, which is environmental, and 9,001, which is quality. So the scope is, and it must be documented, it must define the boundaries and applicability of the management system. But it can only be done once you understand the context and the interested parties and what those needs and requirements are. The leadership section, there's a lot of new terminology being introduced here in terms, previously it was management, etc. They use the word leadership because it's an emphasis on enhancing participation with workers and other interested parties to provide safe and healthy working conditions and the prevention of ill health. So it's a preventative standard. And that's an important element to consider because it's there trying to prevent things from going wrong, not just reacting to things that have gone wrong. And that must be understood. So the requirements there on leadership and a commitment to worker participation. There's requirements there on terms of what leadership must do and what they must commit to do in terms of how they deliver this effective management system. And there's a requirement within the standard for a policy. And the policy must be documented and it must be communicated. The system requires and is intended to provide a commitment to health and safety working conditions, as I said, by prevention of work-related injury and ill health. So the whole management system is seen as a preventative activity. And it talks about injury and ill health, so it's not just including accidents, it's looking at mental health, well-being, and all the things that can be brought about by occupational activity. So it isn't just about cut fingers and injuries to flesh and bones, etc. It's talking about the overall well-being of individuals in terms of their occupational activity. Within the leadership section, organisational roles and responsibilities must be defined, and the phrase accountability has been dropped that's a change from 18,001, and they've dropped the phrase accountabilities. Accountabilities cannot be negotiated away or given to someone else. top management of an organisation are accountable for the operation of that organisation, and that can't be delegated or transferred. That's why it's been removed. Organisation roles need to be available as documented information. And another key element which has been enhanced within 45001 is consultation and participation with workers. Really key to the effective delivery of an ongoing effective management system. So that consultation and participation includes mechanisms from the leadership and the whole organisation to look at removal of barriers, to enhance cooperation and communication, to be given time and resources and information. We see good communication and accept, so it's a two-way participation on communication and training and information, etc. So it's not just a one-way street whereby they're just told what to do. It's about encouraging this ongoing engagement. And non-manager in participation in the whole of the activity of the management standard, not just as and when it's when it's thought appropriate, but they should be involved at all stages, identifying hazards, looking at controls, investigating incidents, even up to and including the creation of the policy. It's very good practice to have some engagement and some involvement of workers in what is the policy of the organisation, what is it going to be. They are the core protection group, they're the people that it's there to protect. So it's good engagement for them to be included in all levels of the activity in terms of the whole of the management standard. In terms of planning, the overall thing is looking at elimination of hazards and therefore then the reduction of risk. And I noticed there's some questions on hazards and risks. So I'll just go through this slide and we'll try and answer some questions. In the planning section, this is where the requirements are for identifying and controlling hazards and risks. This hierarchy of control is a visual demonstration of what you should be aiming for. So a hazard is something that has the potential to cause injury or harm, and the risk is the realization of that hazard actually delivering that damage or harm. So in terms of hierarchy of control, elimination is the most effective method of reducing risk. Hazards and risks, therefore, elimination is most effective, and therefore if you can't then eliminate them entirely, then it could be substitution. So it could be replacing one substance for a less harmful substance in a process. That's one method of substitution. Or doing something in a different way to take out or reduce those risks and hazards of a process as you're going forward. The third level of consideration is engineering control. So that's guarding and that type of control, a physical restraint type activity, and administrative controls. So you can see as we're going down this, as you get to the pointed bit in the PPE, the effectiveness reduces as you go down these controls. So administrative controls, having procedures, etc., can be of limited impact to actually delivering operational control. And then finally, you've got PPE. PPE is the last line of defense when it comes to reducing risk from a particular hazard, because it only protects the individual worker, and it's very reliant on how that equipment is worn and used, etc., etc. So it's the last line of defense when it comes to certain protection methods. So it's really important to use the hierarchy of control when we're looking at the elimination of hazards and subsequently reduction in risk. So now is that I think is appropriate time to look at some questions. So I'll just very quickly just scan through some of the questions and hopefully can. First question, what suggestions do you have to keep the admin proportions proportional for a small management team? I think I answered that one earlier, or tried to answer that one earlier. This is not about, the management standards isn't about creating unnecessary administration or whatever. It's about creating suitable information to give you effective management system. That's the key. So all the requirements within the management standard for documented information, you probably would be, as I said earlier, you probably would be pleasantly surprised of how much of this you are already doing. Certainly if you're working from a basis of 18,001, a lot of these things will already be in place. So it may not be as daunting as it may seem. And it's about getting maximum value out of the information. So how you construct information and how you record that, if you record it in a central place, etc., it can help the administration and reduce the burden of administration. And that applies to all levels of organisation, both small, medium and large. I think every organisation wants to be efficient and effective in what they do. So hopefully that's give you some framework to work on within your organisations. Can the migration assessment be carried out remotely is the next question. That's obviously very, very relevant to our current status within COVID and the various things. And the answer is to that is yes, it can. During COVID and the current global crisis and the pandemic, it's been authorised that all management standards can be, certainly health and safety management standards can be conducted remotely as appropriate. And when you remember, given the technology with remote auditing and the various things now, whether it be Teams or whatever, Skype, we can also do virtual tours of processes, so to make it as realistic as possible. So although it's done remotely, we still have the chance to go and interview people and look at processes and various things. And so it can be achieved using existing technology and frameworks. So yes, the migration assessment can be carried out remotely and effectively. The next question is, if a company has 9,000 and 14,000, should they, just a second, just let me scroll down a little bit. Should they only be audited once for leadership planning, etc.? It depends on how that is established within that organization. So a lot of organizations can have the 3 standards, but they actually manage them separately and they haven't declared the level of integration within their for their certification body. So if they're kept separate within the certification process, then they would be audited separately. You have to declare the level of integration with your certification body to enable collective certification, because that's where the economy of scale can kick in, and you can look at things like context and leadership, etc., in terms of across multidisciplines, but only for a declared integrated management registration. I think we've explained the difference between a risk and a hazard. So just to clarify, a hazard is something that has the potential to cause injury or harm, and the risk is actually the realization of that, or the potential realization of that, looking at probability and severity generally. So that's the difference between a hazard and risk. The other considered question here, do we have to have considered COVID-19 as a related hazard? I would say yes, due to the nature of what it is, and it's impacted across the globe, and it's impacted every sector and almost every occupational activity. So yes, to some extent, it would need to be considered. And certainly here within the UK, there are requirements for those to be documented, and there is in the management standard for that to be documented if it's regarded as a significant risk. So yes, is the answer to that one. In terms of COVID, we are controlling COVID-19 with PPE as the last line of defence, but it isn't the only line of defence. We're using work methods, we're using isolation, all sorts of things. So although PPE is the last line of defence, it is being used extensively, and it's also there to reduce risk of transmission, etc. So it is being used, but it's being used in conjunction with other controls and other methods. And yes, to answer a question, the slides will be sent out post the webinar to those that are registered. So I'll now return to the presentation. So sorry about that interruption, but I thought it was appropriate time to answer the things on risk and all that. So I thought I'll go through all the questions at that point. We can have more questions, don't be frightened, carry on sending them in. It's good to have participation during webinars, and it's good for us to be able to fine tune any future webinars based on those questions. So, in section 6, we look at the planning. So it's actions. So we need to identify risks and opportunities, and we also need to take actions to mitigate those risks and opportunities. So hazard identification and risk assessment are there, both of risks and opportunities. So it could be things that the organisation's planning to do. It could be changes. Actually, we have the opportunity here to change this process, and we can take action to make improvements. This is what it's all about, or to make changes in line with strategic developments within the organisation, linking back to the activities and the context. Also within this section, the determination of legal and other requirements. That's not a new requirement, that's always been there. So that nothing really has changed there, but you've got to be clear that this is, in this section, it's the determination of legal and other requirements, and the evaluation of compliance is in a later section under section 9. So don't confuse those two things. It's a common thing to say, oh, well, we've kept our, a legal register or whatever up to date, so therefore we are compliant. That doesn't meet the full requirements of the standard when it comes to legal and other requirements. There is a requirement to do an evaluation. In the planning section, based on the risks and opportunities that have been identified and assessed, there may be some objectives that can relate either partially or fully to the risks and opportunities identified, and the strategic direction to which the organisation wants to go. So it could be, we want to introduce 45,000. Well, we want to introduce a new process. We want to introduce an automated process to reduce manual handling risk or something like that. So it could be there could be all sorts of things that can be established as objectives in relation to the management standard and the management system based on risk. And also the determination and what's the interested parties need. So it could be, could be a legal change that requires you to make some changes within your organisation. All these things could be set as objectives. The key difference in objectives within 45 is not only do you need to set objectives, but you need to demonstrate and document plans to achieve them. So it's not just like saying, well, we want to reduce risk, for example, or we want to reduce accidents. There should also be a plan of what you intend to do to achieve that. And Objectives generally must be SMART, so they must be measurable, etc. Time specified. People are aware of them. People that are responsible for them, informed, etc. You can't make somebody responsible for something if you haven't then communicated to them. And objectives need to be communicated to the relevant people and interested parties throughout. So it's rolling on from all this integration of and communication, which is really key to an effective OHS management standard. So risk assessment and looking at the identification of risks and hazards is a key fundamental driver of the management system, as is the leadership and context. So all those three things are really key fundamental activities that really help drive what you're doing and why you're doing it. And you can see there, we just put that quick model in there to reinforce the plan, do, check, act process, which is defined in all the management standards throughout. Support section is centered on communication and the leaders of the organization, what they need to provide, etc., and the maintenance and continual improvement of the management system. Within all organizations, there'll need to be some form of resource. There'll need to be information, effective communication, and training is a key element to developing the management standard. All comes in to give you the support mechanisms that are required to deliver the overall effectiveness of the system. So under the resources section of the management standard on clause 7, covers resources, as we've said. It also covers competencies, so which also applies to external workers and contractors. So it could link to the procurement process, etc. And those competence requirements must be maintained and documented as documented information. Awareness, so it's including workers should have the ability and awareness to remove themselves from work situations that present an imminent and serious threat to life. This again is about preventing incidents from occurring. So if workers know and it's also about the culture of the organization. So there shouldn't be any undue consequences from removing themselves from a serious threat. We should be encouraging the prevention of accidents, and the whole culture of the organization should be driven towards that. Communication, the clause has been expanded and needs to include both internal and external communication, and communication, certain types of communication such as policy will need to be documented throughout the management standard. But communication also links to roles and responsibilities, also, etc. So communication is a key element. Documented information can be on a range of media. It's not just hard copy, paper-based things, as we said earlier, and it also must be suitably controlled. So section 7.5 of the standard talks about controlling and issuing of documented information. Section 8, this is the operational control bit. This is what all the management standard is there to try and deliver an effective, safe operation for organisations and their workers. So in terms of the standard, it's quite a small clause in terms of the size of the clauses within the standard, but this is basically the hub of what you're trying to deliver. So in general, it talks about including and maintaining documented information and adapting work to workers. It talks about eliminating hazards and reducing risk. It talks about the management of change. So change is both planned and unplanned. So for example, a department's got a lot of staff on holiday, that's a planned change. An unplanned change is a department that has a lot of staff absence due to ill health or sickness. But in all circumstances, the organisation must try and manage that change and manage that appropriately, maintaining a safe operating condition for the workers that are in the workplace. It now specifically under operating control looks at procurement, and under procurement it then looks at general requirements for contractors and outsourcing requirements. So the structure of the thing has changed in terms of the way the standard is worded, and because procurement is such a key element in a lot of organisations, it's now given its own clause requirements. So that's all in 8.1. And then in 8.2 of the management standard is emergency preparedness and responses. So certain things within that emergency preparedness, you need to retain documented information, both as a means of communication, but also as evidence of for us to be able to audit. So there's requirements there. In performance evaluation, so once we've got the operations and we know what's happening there, and it's time to monitor and measure and analyze our performance in the real world, not so going away from what we thought it was going to deliver. Is it actually delivering that? Is it actually doing what we want it to do? Is it actually preventing number of incidents and accidents? So we need to monitor and measure to confirm that that's being effectively delivered. So it's about looking at the accident reports, incident reports, hazard reports, etc., and using those to influence future decisions. So it's not just about reacting to that one and only incident or accident. It's about using that and going, oh, actually, we can learn lessons, we can move forward. So it's about monitoring all of that, using that information effectively to drive forward improvements over time. And also within there, under 9.1.2 is the evaluation of compliance. So the evaluation of compliance is if we've got a statutory compliance obligation for lifting gear, for example, although having knowledge of that as a statutory obligation, are we actually delivering that obligation? Can we evidence that? How have we checked, or what have we checked to confirm that we're actually complying with that requirement? And that's the evaluation of compliance. So that needs to be documented, it needs to be defined how frequently it's going to take place, etc., etc. And it can take place routinely every week or every month, every whatever. So depending on what that requirement is and what it means to your organisation. So that's why it needs to be defined, and it's important not to misinterpret that with the maintaining the legal register. Maintaining a legal register and information is one requirement. Actually evaluating compliance against those requirements is built into the standard in the 9.1.2. Some of that evaluation may be completed via internal audits. So as all the standards have an internal audit requirement within them, so it's basically a self-checking process, and that internal audit program should consider risk. So it's about looking at things. It's not just about, oh, in January we do that and in February we do that, etc., and which never changed for the last 20 years. If you've got a previous year's performance information to go on, then that may influence your internal audit program to say, we've done a lot of change in a particular area, or we've had a lot of issues in a particular area. I'm going to increase the frequency of audits in that particular area to help verify that the changes that we've made has been effective. So it's about using the management standard to best effect and getting most benefit from it. So internal audits are there about verifying that the process and the activities are delivering the safe system of work that's it's required to. And the audit programme and the results of the audits need to be retained as documented information. And as ever, there is the management review. So there's been some wording changes there, but in principle, the primary role and activity of the management review is looking at the performance, looking at the system, and is the system overall delivering what it needs to? So the standard identifies the inputs to a management review and the outputs, which also includes objectives, the achievement of objectives, new objectives, changes, etc., results of corrective actions, results of consultation, any legal changes, and the status of compliance, etc., etc. All are requirements of the management review linked to the earlier clauses throughout. Section 10 is the improvement section. Really important is the early parts of section 10, and I'll explain that. So the general requirements is determining opportunities for improvement and taking actions to achieve intended outcomes. That's a general requirement of driving forward the requirements of the management standard and developing it for continual improvement. The other element to that is incidents, non-conformity and corrective action. So information on incidents and non-conformities and the corrective action taken needs to be retained as documented information. It also requires worker participation, including investigations, reviewing accidents, incidents, and the assessment of actions prior to taking action. So you should assess an action prior to taking the action, because you don't want to create a bigger hazard or a bigger risk than the one you're trying to alleviate. And this is what can sometimes happen when people don't think about their actions. They say, oh, we'll just change this. And they don't think about that action and the risks it can incur. And then all of a sudden, they've got a risk there that A, they haven't assessed because they didn't even go through the assessment process, and it causing more problems than it actually alleviates. So it can be it's a key element of that process in terms of 10.2. And continual improvement is there looking at enhancing performance and promoting a culture of support, worker participation, communication, and a lot of these things need required documented information so that we can support, you can show me evidence of that. And we'll also get evidence as part of the audit process by actually undertaking interviews and various things. So it's not purely about documented information, it's the whole evidence that can be interviewed, records, data, performance information, etc. So that's a very quick overview of all the requirements. So the key points to bear in mind, if you're starting from scratch, because a lot of organisations may not have 18,001 and they may be going straight into getting 45,001. So read the standard, have a copy of the standard available to you. To put it in simple terms, you wouldn't play a game without knowing the rules. Well, if you don't have the standard and you're trying to implement a system to an ISO standard and you don't have a copy of the standard, then I would almost guarantee you could fall very short in various elements. So it's always good, and there's always guidance in there as well. So it's not just about the clauses themselves, there's support and information that's contained within the standards that's very useful for clients to use. Identify sources of legal compliance and information. So identify where you're going to get all this information from, how you're going to get all this legal information, where is it going to come from, etc. Review existing hazards and risks. Build on what you've already got within your organisation. Conduct a gap analysis to identify improvement points. And if need be, NQA can provide this service, but that's at a cost. We do provide gap guides and guidance support and information for clients, etc. But to do a formal get an assessor come in and look at your management standard and look at your system and your organisation is a chargeable activity. But you can also do one internally, so we do provide documents and support to help you do that. Complete system internal audits. That's the verification that, oh, we think it's doing that. Is it? It's a very strong tool, is internal audit. Don't be frightened of using it to the benefit of the system. You want to conduct a management review, and then you can look at confirmation of registration and initial assessments, both stage 1 and stage 2. That's if you're starting from scratch. If you're migrating from OHSAS 18001, again, read the standard. Conduct a gap analysis. Yeah. And the same things apply there. You can do that internally, but you can also get NQA to perform that. Completion of a migration gap analysis. So for existing NQA clients that are registered with us for 18001, we do provide you with a migration gap analysis document to help you go through the process of confirming that you're ready to migrate your system. And complete the system internal audits as required and revised for 45001. So it isn't just about maintaining your 18001 program, it's about looking at the new elements, context and leadership, etc., and ensure that you've looked at those and it's covered within your management standard internal audit program. Conduct a management review and then confirm dates with your certification body, i.e. NQA, as to when you're going to want the migration to be completed, etc. And as I say, for existing clients of 18001, it isn't just a like-for-like migration in terms of duration. There is a minimum addition of at least 1 day to cover context and leadership elements. That can go up depending on the scale of the operation and the size of the operation that's being assessed. So it's a minimum of 1 day for any size of operation. So there we go. That's a very quick whistle-stop tour of those points. And to clarify in terms of the actual migration dates for 18001 to 45, the migration date was revised due to COVID-19 and it was extended from March 2021 to September 2021. That was to allow, because of all the impact of COVID-19, etc., that is to allow organisations additional time to make the migration from one to the other. So I'll just open up on the questions again and see whether we've got so quite a few questions here, so I'll quickly go through those as best I can. Just to clarify as well, what we intend to do as a follow-on from this webinar is that based on all your questions and all your requirements that you ask within the course of the webinar, we're also going to do a blog in a few weeks to answer some of the key questions, etc., that have been brought up. So if I can't answer them fully today, we'll try and answer them more fully by the follow-up blog, but we'll certainly give it a go today. So we got down to there. So next question was, what training and competence in 45001 would you expect to see in place for the management team? I can't really answer that because it depends on what level of competence the management team already have. So it depends on the requirements of the organisation, etc., etc., etc. So it's quite an individual. There's no set requirements in terms of the management standard, but they need to be suitably engaged with and have the understanding of, or they can get support of external agencies. So in answer to that question, there's no defined answer in terms of the management standard. The next question, do we have to add Pandemic Act or Epidemic Act in the legal register? If it's a requirement that you need to comply with, then your legal register should be maintained as to identify what you're trying to comply with, what you think is relevant to you, and how you're going to comply to it. That's the requirement of the standard. So anything that applies and it's appropriate and is applicable to your operations and your organisation needs to be included in there. That includes statutory obligations, but it could also include customer obligations, etc., etc. Because it could be about protecting customer workers and all that type of thing. So they may say to you, we want you to deliver that in this method because. So that's a customer requirement that you'd need to comply with, not just a statutory duty. So yes, anything, that's the whole point of having these things in the management standard, is to make sure that they capture and reflect what's appropriate and applicable to your organisation. What is the difference between an objective and an environmental management programme? I assume that's what you mean by EMP. Objectives can be both strategic and related to hazards and risks that an organisation face based on its context. It's just terminology, really. I would say that your objectives need to relate to the context of the organisation and the leadership of the organisation and the hazards that and risks that organisation face in terms of OHS. The basic principles of the activity remain constant. How to conduct mock drills during COVID-19? It's a tough time. But you still need to consider emergency preparedness. You still need to check that any changes actually deliver. You know, it's no good saying, well, we've changed all the evacuation routes, etc., for a premises, and then all of a sudden, you know, you don't actually test that to see that it works. And that's the point. Whatever change you make, you must evaluate that it's been effective and it still delivers, meets the needs. So even though it's been done for COVID-19, there's nothing to say that during COVID-19 you're not going to have a fire evacuation, for example. How do we remote audit internal audits? Well, we want to see evidence of the audit program. We want to see evidence of the audit reports, and we may well have a discussion with the people that are conducting the audits. How did it go, etc., etc. So there's various means of doing that assessment for internal audits, doing it remotely. Can internal audits be conducted remotely? Well, we conduct our audits remotely. So yes, if you've got various sites, for example, rather than you increasing risk of COVID, for example, and by traveling to sites to conduct audits, you can conduct them audit remotely as long as it's effective. So that's the key thing there. It's about the effectiveness of the audit. What level of OHS auditor training would you expect internal auditors to have? There's no specified requirement within the OHS management standard, but you may define your own competency requirements within your organisation under 7.2, and that could be based on experience, it could be based on training, it could be a combination of both. So but the standard itself does not define auditor competence in terms of for internal auditors. And I think the final question is, will the webinar be available to view later? As I said, yeah, all the slides will be sent out to all those registered, and it will be available via our social media. Download there, you can listen to the recording, etc., at your leisure. So from my point of view, hopefully that's clarified a few things for you. Hope, you know, in some way, I hope it's been thought-provoking. And these management standards, certainly in the current situation, don't neglect your management standard. It's there to help the organisation. It's not there to hinder it. It's not there to be an administrative burden within an organisation, but it does require investment in time and resources to make it deliver effective benefit. And now is not the time to abandon or neglect your management standard and the way your organisation works. One last question. If issues are found at audit, what is the protocol to put things right? It depends on significance of what that impacts on, its significance in terms of impact on the organisation, its impact on hazard and risk. So it's like everything else. You've got to make some priorities. You can't do everything in 24 hours. So depending on what the level of finding is, and depending on the impact of that finding on the organisation and the workers within the organisation, then you've got to fit appropriate timescales to that. There's no single methodology that's been applied within the standard. It's down to the organisation to define that that's appropriate for its corrective and improvement actions. So thank you all very much, and keep safe and just be careful during the pandemic. And as I say, use your management standard and your management system to keep workers protected. That's the core activity. So keep up the good work. We're doing a good job. Let's move forward safely. Thank you all very much.